In this video, I sit down with Chris Valdivieso to discuss his article called "Why Does Quality Matter? QM Practices in the Language Industry Should Be More Than Profit-Driven, a Case Study in Madagascar." While our conversation centers upon the case of Madagascar, the insights Chris shares in this interview are broadly applicable to many of the world's low-resource languages. Chris starts by sharing his definition of quality in translation, interpreting and localization, and about how quality relates to the ethics of language services. Next, Chris lays out the reasons why a lack of market awareness is likely to cause translation efforts for the Madagascan market to fail. He then discusses the characteristics of the market that should be at the forefront when defining translation services for this market. Chris goes on to discuss how the infrastructure in Madagascar impacts the design of localized products. Our conversation also addresses language industry standards, specifications, language digitalization, terminology management, vendor management, and process management. Chris Valdivieso is a French to English translator and localizer whose areas of specialization include political science, international relations, history, and humanitarian endeavors. Chris holds a Bachelor of Arts in French and Political Science from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and a Master of Arts in Translation with a specialization in localization management from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. Chris currently works as a language specialist at Innodata. We're excited to share Chris's insights on the Madagascan market specifically and on quality management broadly with you. Let's go to Chris's and my conversation now.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Chris. It's such a pleasure to see you again, and I really look forward to talking about your project.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you for having me.
All right. So we'll just jump right into the questions. We're going to talk about quality in general first. And so I wondered if we could start by hearing about your interest in quality management as it applies to language services like translation, interpretation, localization.
Certainly. So yeah, I've had the privilege of providing language services in all three of these areas to different degrees. But I'm particularly interested in the ethical aspect of quality management because the industry in the United States, from my experience, it lacks universal regulation. So unfortunately, the language professional in the United States often finds himself or herself in difficult situations with little to no guidance and support on how to best carry out their profession when ethical questions arise. That really interests me, those issues.
And so, what is your experience with quality management in the language industry or in other fields as well?
So I work for companies that are rigorous with regard to quality management, as well as companies that are not so much, both inside and outside the language industry. The only thing I can really say from experience is that organizations can potentially open themselves up to serious liabilities if quality management isn't taken seriously. Specifically, I've seen questionable practices that could have been addressed using ISO-related standards. Sometimes the industry in the United States, I've heard it referred to as the Wild West. And I think it's an appropriate epithet. Not everyone strives for high standards, and there are only a handful of organizations that I know of that are really even attempting to effectively monitor these standards.
I would agree. And we just had a biannual meeting of ASTM F43. That's a group that writes international standards. It's US based on translation and localization. We were talking about generative AI and all of the big claims that are being made around, it's going to replace translators. And it seems like it's a cycle where every time a new technology is introduced, or even maybe not even technology, but there's all these wild claims that are made about what people and systems and technologies can do. And then it takes a while for people to realize that those are just claims. They're not actually what's possible. And so I think there are definitely players that take advantage of that. And it's unfortunate because a lot of buyers aren't aware of that. You know that I like to start discussions on quality by talking about how we think about quality and what our definitions of quality are. You know, we have language that there are shared ideas that we have that allow us to communicate through language, where we all sort of have a somewhat of a sense of what words mean, but then each individual has their own ideas about what things are too. And so I wondered if you would give us your general definition of what quality for translation, interpreting, and localization is.
I mean, generally speaking, I would define quality in TIL as the assessment of a service and or product, and then comparing that assessment to the needs and expectations of the client at the minimum. That's the minimum. Exceptional quality, if a product is exceptional, you might be able to define that as going above and beyond these expectations. I think that's what a lot of businesses and companies strive for. To your previous point, though, real quick about the state of the AI technology right now, I like to tell people from what I've seen, it's kind of like analogous to the wizard hiding behind the curtain.
That's a good
That's what it's
analogy.
like. Once you open the curtain, it's not what you expect, but on the surface, yeah, they want to show something that's amazing, spectacular.
Yeah. All right, let's dive into your case study, because when talking about quality in the article that you wrote, you talked about wanting to make the case for an approach to localization that is not purely profit driven. And you wanted to make the case for that in a way that's more tangible, easier to visualize. And so you decided to work with Madagascar and localization for the Madagascan audience. So why did you choose Madagascar for your case study?
Yeah, well, to make a long story short, I've managed to become familiar enough over the years with the country to know that it would be a good candidate for showing how some regions in the world present real challenges for entrepreneurs who might want to invest in those places, especially those in the language industry. So many years ago, I purchased a book that recounts the invasion and subsequent occupation of Madagascar by France. I'm a big history buff, and French is my second language. I was just looking for something different to read.
Yeah.
But that was my first real introduction into the history and culture of Madagascar. Because up until then, the only things I really associated with that country were rainforests and lemurs,
Mm,
which do bring actually those two things bring in a lot of international tourism and
mm,
money to the island. But I had no idea that Madagascar is a nation with a very complex and rich history, and it's very, very diverse on an ethno-linguistic level. Um, from a colonial perspective, it's a tragic history.
mm,
So the fact that this nation sits between two major continents in the Indian Ocean means that geopolitical conflicts were nearly inevitable. The island is rich in natural resources, so I think it was only a matter of time before outside powers started looking at this country covetously. But many of these foreign cultures have left their mark over the years in some way on, these various indigenous groups that live there, including their languages, which was what I'm particularly interested in.
So the premise for your case study was addressing the translation and localization of books for the Madagascan market. And you start off with this case study by looking at what a surface level approach would look like. Could you tell us what a surface level approach to localization for that market would be?
Yeah, so I mean, the product could be just about anything, but I used the book market to try to make the argument more straightforward. Larger publishing houses, they tend to not commit to marketing a title unless they know, or at least they have a reason to believe that it's going to be successful and make a decent profit. So for most people, it would only take about a minute or two to carry out a basic internet search and find out what languages are most commonly used in Madagascar. The last time I checked, the World Factbook, which is produced and maintained by the CIA, it states that Malagasy and French are the two official languages in that country, and that Malagasy is spoken by 99.9% of the population. So I imagined a scenario where a potential book publisher did some basic research and they found information like this
Hmm.
and concluded that, okay, well, their English language books should be translated into Malagasy and French to be successful in that country. But in fact, I hypothesized that maybe, well, their book might have a high chance of failure because the publisher failed to dig deeper and try to understand the local environment where their product will be released into. This actually happens quite a bit in the real world, even with large and well-known companies. So one starts to wonder if these are genuine miscalculations or if cultural research is simply being ignored
Yeah.
before a product is released.
Yeah, so one of the things I really enjoyed about the article was the emphasis on doing market research. And I think it made it more tangible too, that you went through and you discussed first the surface level approach and why that would probably fail, before diving into the details of, okay, if someone is going beyond this surface level approach to actually doing the job of localization and being, market aware, what are the characteristics that we would need to be aware of?
I mentioned that 89.9% inhabitants speak Malagasy, according to the World Factbook. Now, the uninformed likely see that statistic and assume that Malagasy is a single uniform language, but that would be a misguided conclusion. The official Malagasy language is actually a dialect known as the Merina dialect. It's also called Plateau Malagasy. And in fact, it's only one of several dialects on the island. So there's a database called the Ethnologue, which is SIL Global's language database, and it has identified 12 distinct dialects of Malagasy. And all of these dialects possess ISO language codes. They're mutually intelligible dialects for the most part, but research has shown, some people have found that many native speaking inhabitants on the island, they actually struggle with reading the Merina dialect, which is the official language. So yes, the majority of the population speaks Malagasy, but that's not exactly the whole story.
So if they would translate the book into Malagasy, then they would
Yeah, it
wind up
would,
facing a situation where people
yeah,
would,
still only a limited part of the population able to actually read it.
yeah. So then you explored in your article as well, what would be some of the potential ways of addressing this? Because it's also not fair to say, okay, if you can't read the official dialect, you don't get access to these materials. And so what could you tell us about the solution that you explored?
Hmm. So in this situation, the various Malagasy dialects, again, they have the advantage of being somewhat mutually intelligible. The level of intelligibility varies depending on the region, but the Merina dialect has been standardized in the Latin script. So I think it would make sense to continue using that from the get-go. Malagasy was historically actually transcribed using an Arabic-based uh, consonantal alphabet called Sarabe, which dates back to the 15th century. But the only other option I can think of right now would be to use some type of phonetic script, maybe sight translation at first, but then maybe a phonetic script because that's a common technique that I've seen used in language learning literature at all levels. But you've probably seen this. I'm sure you've seen this. It's often very clunky in books. But I think that would help the localization process, at least at first, with regard to any terminology that is unstandardized. Non-standard grammar would be a tougher animal to tackle. I don't know. I'm not sure how to go about that.
And so the idea would be to write the the dialect in the phonetic form so that it could be read
So,
by,
yeah, so then it could be used by a voice actor, for
okay.
example.
So you're looking at an audio solution here then for texts when
Yes.
they can't be read in written form.
Again, this is a fictional scenario, but I would envision that a publisher would want to partner with a traditional voice talent agency, like a local company that represents individuals who have auditioned for the audio project. But it's probably more realistic to expect the publisher to be forced to seek out native speakers who are non-professionals, since we're dealing with low resource languages.
Yeah.
But even if that were the case, you would still need to collaborate with language professionals who have a background in Malagasy. I mean, they are out there. But then we also include French, the French translators, if they want to translate the book into the country's other official language, it's French. Then you have the editors, the proofreaders, a final review team, and now pretty quickly we're dealing with a fairly large pool of SMEs. So it
Yeah.
could get complicated quickly, I'm sure.
Do you have ideas about what training would look like for any non-professionals in culture experts that are being brought in that, know the language because they speak it, they know what people will expect to hear, what will resonate?
That's an excellent question because I mean, on the one hand, you would ideally have people that are already trained professionally. But if we're dealing with role resource languages, this is one place where using these ISO related guidelines would be frustrating because they're sometimes hard, if not impossible, to comply with. So now we're drifting back into questions of ethical practices. I think it would be extremely hard to hold teams up to the same high standards used by high resource languages, but at the same time, you have to start somewhere. And I think this is where the language industry can help blaze trails. So if you have a group of professionals who can start agreeing to a consensus on a certain issue or a question, in this case, it's like, okay, well, you have someone here who speaks the local dialect. How do we want to prepare this individual who's not a professional? How do we want to prepare them to work on this project? I mean, we could be in a part of the world, not Madagascar necessarily, but in a part of the world where there just aren't any institutions
Yeah.
that are conferring professional degrees or certificates for translation or in this minority language. Then we have to come up with, well, what's the next best thing? I don't know the answer to that question, but I mean, you might find someone who has experience translating, they've never received professional translating. Well, that's an opportunity, at least for development of a program or a course from ground zero.
I don't remember the woman's name, but she gave a presentation at the OMT conference, the Organization of Mexican Translators, at their conference last year on training interpreters of Mexico's indigenous languages to help people go through the court systems who don't speak Spanish. There's a large population of people who speak indigenous languages here in Mexico, and she was facing the same sort of issue where, there's these standards, the ISO 17100 standard that states certain qualifications are necessary, like 5 years of experience, a degree in translation, a degree in another field, or 2 or 3 years of experience. So it was very interesting to hear that case study too of how she went about training people so that they could be interpreters. I'm going to look that up and include a link to it in the description for this when I post this on YouTube. It's interesting too that folks within the standards community are starting to talk about this too, about writing into the ASTM F2575 standard, which is the translation quality standard, requirements for low resource languages. So acknowledging the fact that these ISO requirements are great for high resource languages, for low resource languages, not realistic. And so coming up with an alternative framework that just acknowledges the many paths to translation and localization that we have out there. Would you like to comment at all on like the process management that would be entailed by your project?
Hmm. I mean, I would like to think that just the traditional, waterfall model would be the most appropriate, just having a simple linear workflow, translate, edit, proofread. Okay, pass it on to the voice actor now. But because we're talking about so many different partners and teams being involved, and because the financial risk would be high, I think some aspects of the agile method might be very helpful. I'm mostly thinking of consistent and regular feedback
Mm.
between the various teams before the product releases, which I know would be a lot of work, but I think it would be worth the trouble. Especially detailed feedback from test audiences, I think would be especially invaluable for the final localized product. One of the best things about quality management, though, is that it can be tailored to the specific project. So I think there's definitely more than one way. There's got to be more than one way to go about it. It just depends on what's going on the ground. Once they get there, what do they find is most necessary to pay attention to?
Yeah, that communication would be a crucial piece. I think people often forget that, communication is necessary. It has a cost associated with it because it takes time, but that it's a necessary piece. What was really interesting, so you already had this linguistic challenge that you were addressing with your case study of producing audio content. And then you went on to also look at like infrastructure on the ground in terms of regular access to electricity and digital technology. So could you talk about that additional challenge a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I recently had discovered, I did not know this, but there's a small ethnic group, I think that's an ethnic group, but there's a small group of hunter-gatherers that still exists in Madagascar.
Wow.
And they're not one of those no contact groups, but I mean, that's how undeveloped a lot of the island is. So when I first wrote this article, I sat down and tried to brainstorm some solutions to this issue. I wondered if it was possible to create an audiobook that could somehow be attached to a traditional print book so that the device could be mobile. It could be used with an independent power supply. They don't have to worry about being close to an electric outlet all the time. Well, I soon realized that this technology already exists. There's a company called Library Ideas that produces a product line known as Vox Books.
Hmm.
My son has enjoyed using them on his own. They're very easy to use, and the company is already in the multilingual market. But one of the coolest features about this product is that the audio playback device contains a charging port for the battery. So I think that would be very helpful when you're talking about communities that if they have irregular access, maybe they don't have any access at all. I
Yeah.
mean, that's how undeveloped this country is in many parts of the island.
It makes me think of the further infrastructure that could be leveraged in order to make a book that's translated using this methodology available, like having central libraries where books could be recharged and then sent out. So there's a lot of sharing happening too. That seems like it could be a pretty cool way to make the most of resources.
Mhm.
But what's really interesting still, so the it keeps getting more and more interesting, this case study, because when we think about the product design then, well, I guess the product design could be multi-purpose, because
Mhm.
when I was thinking about this at first, I was like, okay, if this is, if you're working with spoken dialects that don't necessarily have a written form, what would the book itself look like? Because books normally have the words on the page and then you like press play or something like that, and then the audio comes out. But
Yeah.
what do you do about the words on the page?
Yeah. I mean, for sure, an original design, maybe something completely novel would be needed in this case. And I'm not sure how feasible that would be, but I don't see why multiple tracks couldn't be made available. Like you said, typically you would have a book, an audiobook that could play and you would read along with a single set of text. For example, one track would read the actual printed text that appears on the page. This would be the standardized Marina dialect, for example, and then why not have additional tracks that could also be available, which then contain these various dialects without the accompanying text because they're not even standardized anyways, and a lot of people can't read them, but we still want to get them access to books. Another technique that I've seen pretty often is parallel text. This is when you have the same concepts are being displayed in close proximity to each other on a page, but in different languages or scripts. Um, by the way, this is how hieroglyphics were finally deciphered on the Rosetta Stone, parallel text. I think the real issue isn't that a new script needs to be invented, but simply that these dialects, they just never been standardized in written form. No one's taken the time to really do that.
What I think is interesting about the idea with having the Malagasy and that audio version and then the additional audio versions is that it becomes exactly what you wanted it to be, which is a teaching tool that addresses illiteracy as well, where people
Mhm.
have this product, they're hearing stories, they're able to connect the stories with words on a page. It makes learning much more dynamic too. Learning, you know, if it's not dynamic and interesting, people don't want to do it, and then it's not as engagement falls, retention falls, uh, things like that. Who would be the additional people you would need on your team to produce the design components of this product?
Well, in a broad sense, it would require a team who has the ability to take a spoken language and put it on paper for the first time ever. And that's not a small task. And I'm not trying to sound arrogant when I say it, but this is the kind of thing I'm referring to when I say that the language industry can blaze trails. So not only are you creating products for consumers, but here's the opportunity now where the industry can start creating these linguistic milestones. They're being reached for these languages that have only been translated or transmitted orally for centuries, possibly millennia. So yeah, you need experts, but you also need potentially these non-experts. They still have knowledge though. We just wouldn't necessarily call them experts, so to speak, but we need to collaborate with them.
So, in thinking about process management, you talked a little bit earlier about piloting the book in front of small groups first. Are there other components of process management in terms of the design that you'd like to discuss?
hmm I think what I'm thinking of is cultural consultancy. These people who know the locale intimately, because they're the ones, I mean, I think this is where a lot of these large companies, they make these blunders because we need people who are able to catch these mistakes and issues that are probably really invisible to our Western eyes. But to them, the issue may stick out like a sore thumb.
Yeah.
So yeah, they definitely need to be on the team. You have all of these different moving parts guided by specialists in their respective area. Uh, you would need a linear workflow, I think, for that, but it can be customized to include some aspects of these um, non-experts, I'll call them. For example, let's say you have a script that has already been recorded in the studio, and now it gets to the final review stage, but the reviewer is confused by some of the terminology that's being used.
Mm.
It would be great if that issue could be found before the product was released. I mean, reviewers typically have the ability to reject the product and then send it back up the workflow, but this is potentially disastrous for a project since it delays. The project costs time and money, but what if you were to give, for example, the voice actors, okay, they're not professionals, maybe so to speak, but ideally they're familiar with the language that they're recording. Can we give them the ability to voice their opinions? I mean, I think that might seem unconventional, potentially frustrating for these experts, but I think it would save potentially a lot of time and money in the end if these issues are caught more upstream. I like the idea of that process a lot.
I do too. And in thinking about the voice actors, they're going to have to do rehearsals, right?
hmm
They're going to have to do several
Yeah,
recordings anyways. And so if it's not until the final recording that you're catching terminology issues, it's,
good point.
by then it's a little bit too late. You almost would want to take your one of the first draft recordings, get it out to a small group, have them listen to it, comment on it, do the second draft recording, um, and keep going from there until you have a product that mostly reflects the terminology on the ground. I would imagine there's quite a bit of, even within the various dialects, I would imagine that there's some variation happening too in terms of terminology. It's it's a fascinating question because it makes me think about too, like it makes me wonder how something like different age groups or different age
Hmm.
groups, let's go with that. So like in the United States, I like to give the example a lot that if we were really customizing things, you might use a different language for baby boomers, you might use a different, the text would be different for millennials, it would be different for whatever the younger generations are. Like you would have a different text because particularly for content that requires a high amount of personalization. And so it makes me wonder how similar things would come into play too when studying these dialects of Malagasy.
Yeah, I think it would make for a more effective product if people or companies did that. I mean, it would depend on the project. Sometimes you do want that neutral,
Yeah.
sometimes academic language, but in my experience, yeah, the most effective products are ones that, kind of prick you in the heart. It hit you right there because just the language used or how it was said. Yeah, I agree with that.
So we've essentially been having a conversation about specifications here, defining work requirements in a very detailed way, in a way that takes into account the reality on the ground when defining things like people, process, technologies to be used. Were there any additional requirements that you'd want to make note of, or were there any requirements that you particularly wanted to emphasize?
Yeah, I think so. In the article, I mentioned the guide, Indigenous Languages, Zero to Digital, which was created by Translation Commons, and it's available for free online. But that guide states that nearly 6,000 languages throughout the world have a small or non-existent digital presence. A lot, if not most of these languages are low resource languages. So relatively speaking, there isn't even always a lot of material to guide the language learner or language professional when they want to develop new content. So sometimes it's up to you to create the content. Many of the world's languages need simple people, so to speak, to do the grunt work. But if it's not done responsibly, this is where I think it could certainly negatively affect the development of the language. Everything is shared so easily now in the digital age, and sometimes it takes a lot of effort to sift through the bad information to get to that good information.
Mm.
But I think translation and localization are more influential when, these standards are specified, when we use them, and then maintain them, improve them. Very effective in this industry, I think, if it's done in the right way.
I'm, I'm glad you bring up the Indigenous Languages Guide, and I thought it was very interesting too that you mentioned all of the dialects have ISO codes, because
Mhm.
getting ISO codes is one of the things that the Indigenous Languages Zero to Digital Guide covers, is like step by step, you need to get the language code for ISO to be
Right.
ISO to be able to even have the content tagged as that language online. Then you need like your fonts, the fonts need to be in Unicode. And so it does that very detailed step by step of what all of the steps in the process are. What do you think is the importance of the LSP and the quality management team in all of this?
In a project like this, I think it's fair to say that the LSP and the quality management team, especially, they would have the smallest amount of investment in the project, but because of the nature of the work, I think the roles and responsibilities would arguably make or break the final product. I mean, of course, it's asking a lot to achieve perfection. Humans will always make mistakes, and a good management team will always realize this, but this is part and parcel of the industry. It's the nature of it. In order to give the product every chance of success, the margin of error should be fairly close to zero. And I think that's why quality management is so important to these fields. They need to be front and center.
And let's say you wanted to reverse this case study and bring Madagascan knowledge and stories to global audiences. What takeaways would you have that you would apply?
Just know who your audience is. Um, it's a simple premise, but I think it will take you a long way to achieving your goal. For example, there's a book in the first chapter of Stephen Ellis's The Rising of the Red Shawls. It's a benchmark piece of literature in Malagasy history.
Hmm.
There's a lengthy discussion in that first chapter on explaining to Western audiences how there's this Malagasy word, fuku. It's an extremely difficult word to translate into English. The concept, it just doesn't exist in Anglophone societies. So he eventually settles on the term and he warns the reader, I'm choosing this, but it's just because it's good enough. It's not perfect. But he settles on the word deem, which I hadn't really heard of. Usually it's used in reference to ancient Greece, a concept in ancient Greece, because terms such as tribe and clan, they're just not adequate to describe these ethnic divisions in Madagascar, where ethnicity usually involves a combination of ancestral lineage, territorial origin, and caste divisions. But on top of that, historically, these divisions have also been created artificially through political interventions, usually as a royal favor. The king or queen would say, okay, you did me a favor, I'm going to grant you a favor. You're this ethnic group now. And it sticks over the generations. That just doesn't happen in the United States that I know of. So how do you translate that? But if you want the translation or localized product to be effective in the United States or another English-speaking country, you have to do a really awesome job of explaining what this means to the audience. So that's what I kind of think of when if you were to reverse that. You just have to make it meaningful to the audience in the end.
That's fantastic. And it makes me think of all of the concepts coming from Western culture. If we're thinking about translating from English, for example, that probably wouldn't make sense too, where really the terminology management and thinking thoughtfully about how to convey concepts becomes very, very important. What are your overall takeaways from this project?
I think this research has helped me to better understand for sure this responsibility that comes with working in these fields. The products in the TIL industries have the potential to affect significant and lasting changes in the societies that use them. A lot of products in the world, we purchase them, we use them, and we discard them. We don't think about them ever again. But language services and products they'll enjoy an extended period of use long after the completion of the actual project. I don't think it's going too far to say that there's a sort of legacy that can be the result of this kind of work. I think a large percentage of the language industry's reputation, it depends on the quality of the project and how that quality is managed.
That's such a great point. Thank you so much for sharing about this very fascinating and well thought out project with me and with us, with the folks who will end up watching this recording. Switching gears a little bit, could you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing now at Innodata as a language specialist?
Yeah, I'm a bilingual language specialist at a company called Innodata, and my role is to help train AI language models, specifically in the French language. Innodata works with some of the biggest tech companies in the world, and machine capabilities they're becoming impressive, as the public has seen over the last few years. So there's it's a really popular thing in the news right now, what's happening with AI. But when you really start to research AI and what it can do right now, AI models continue to perform poorly when it comes to training themselves. They need help. So my role is basically to look at the information that machines are producing and, just add a human touch. Real people can fine tune the available data to ensure the models are using this, the best information possible to train and get better at producing responses. I know that's a very vague response, but unfortunately, contractual obligations, I can't give a lot of detail.
Yeah.
It's usually not conventional translation work. Sometimes it is, but it does require a bilingual individual to assess the quality of the language being produced and to sometimes produce original content for the model.
That's wonderful. I think there's this assumption when we use things like generative AI that it's all machines and, people don't think much about what has to happen behind the scenes in order to have the machines producing outputs that are accurate and safe and high quality. And so it's nice to hear a little bit about that, even on a very general level. And it's awesome to know that someone with your expertise is working on that and someone with your perspective is working on that. That I like to bookmark conversations on quality management with the same question. I like asking a lot, what is quality to you? I like asking that a lot because I think that, as I was saying earlier, every single person has their own individual definition of whatever idea is being discussed. Our definitions change over time as we, come into contact with new experiences. Hopefully our minds change every once in a while as we're learning new things. And so given your case study and your work now, would you define quality for us in specific terms?
Mhm. Well, in the real world, quality is often relative. It's in the eye of the beholder a lot of the times. It's relative to a client's needs and expectations. So again, I think quality is an assessment that's made of a service and or product. And then you want to compare that assessment to the needs and expectations of the client. But with that said, I know there are groups like the International Organization of Standardization that strive to identify and define universal standards. And I think these standards should be a baseline of what quality looks like in the professional language industry, but also many industries, especially for those looking, to purchase language services and don't exactly know what to look for at first. So that's one reason why paying attention to quality is very important for someone who's not initiated. Where do they start?
Great, thank you so much. Are there any final thoughts or concluding remarks that you'd like to close your interview with?
I just want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to visit with you. I'm always thrilled to talk shop with other language professionals, but in particular native born Americans, because I know what road they probably took to get there. There are stereotypes out there that aren't always very flattering to Americans, and I know this industry can feel very isolating at times, particularly in our own smaller spheres of influence, people that might not share our passion for language. So my final thought would be just to keep that curiosity alive and to not be afraid to make mistakes. Keep shattering those stereotypes and learning about the people and world around you.
That is such a beautiful closing. Thank you so much, Chris. I've enjoyed very much catching up with you as well. Let's do it again soon. I would love to hear more about your work. And just thank you so much for your time. I know you're very busy and yeah, thank you so much.
Likewise. Thanks, Leda. Bye.